Okay. You may or may not be able to tell that I'm a mouse today. Mm, yeah, I don't know. Either way, today we're going to be discussing the social impact of the Industrial Revolution. Um, we are going to, where are the buttons? We are going to, hang on. Okay, I don't know. The buttons aren't working. My computer's my computer. All right, let's see what we got here.
2. Social impact of industrialism. Objectives. Outline the growth of industrial cities and the emergence of new social classes. Describe the working conditions in factories and mines. Analyze the benefits and challenges of industrialism. Describe the ideas of Adam Smith and other thinkers regarding free enterprise. Identify the origins and characteristics of socialism and communism. Key terms: urbanization, tenements, labor unions, standard of living, social mobility, free market. Thomas Malthus, Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism, socialism, means of production, Robert Owen, Karl Marx, communism, proletariat, social democracy.
The Industrial Revolution was a turning point in world history. It raised the average incomes of people all over the world and influenced every aspect of daily life. With the Industrial Revolution came rapid urbanization. Small towns quickly grew into cities as people scrambled to move near the factories that gave them work. Urban populations increased at a rate not seen before. The middle class grew stronger during the Industrial Revolution. It consisted primarily of merchants, inventors, and skilled artisans, with a segment of this population having worked itself out of poverty. Middle class people lived in nice homes, dressed well, and had access to food and water. Women stayed home to raise and take care of the children. In contrast, life for factory workers was not so easy. Workers lived in slums where buildings had no running water or sanitation systems. Sewage often contaminated the water supply, so diseases like cholera were widespread. Religion, in particular a movement called Methodism, gave the workers comfort. As people migrated to cities and lost connections with their old churches, John Wesley founded Methodism and encouraged his followers to adopt clean living and a personal sense of faith. One of the main goals of Methodism was to rekindle hope in the working class people. Conditions in factories were generally poor. Schedules were long and rigid. Shifts could be up to 16 hours per day and up to 6 days per week. Because of the harsh conditions and inadequate machinery, exhausted workers often became sick or were injured. Many lost their lives. Many of the early workers in the factories were women, not men. Because women were paid far less than men and were thought to be more manageable, they were highly sought out. Being in the workforce created a huge burden for women. They were out of their homes and factories for 12 hours or more a day. And once they were off the clock, they had to take care of home life. If working conditions in the factories were bad, conditions in the mines were even worse. Miners worked in darkness, and the dust from the coal destroyed their lungs. The threat of explosions, flooding, and collapsing tunnels always loomed large. Children were also a part of the workforce, starting to work as young as 5 years of age. Because they were small, nimble-fingered, and quick-moving, they were in very high demand. In factories, children changed spools and crawled under machines to make repairs. In mines, they adjusted air vents and hauled coal carts. The Industrial Revolution greatly affected the lives of men, women, and children. Was this time in history a blessing or a curse?
Yes. So a blessing or a curse? We're about to find out. Industry causes urban growth.
Industry causes
Wow.
urban growth. The Industrial Revolution brought great riches to most of the entrepreneurs who helped set it in motion. It also provided employment for farmers and farmhands displaced by the changes in agriculture. But these jobs came with a heavy price. Millions of workers who crowded into the new factory towns endured dangerous working conditions, unsanitary and overcrowded housing, and unrelenting poverty. In time, reforms would curb many of the worst abuses of the early industrial age in Europe and the Americas. As standards of living increased, people at all levels of society would benefit from industrialization. The Industrial Revolution brought rapid urbanization, or the movement of people to cities. Changes in farming, soaring population growth, and an ever-increasing demand for workers led masses of people to migrate from farms to cities. Almost overnight, small towns around coal or iron mines mushroomed into cities. Other cities grew up around the factories that entrepreneurs built in once quiet market towns. The British market town of Manchester numbered 17,000 people in the 1750s. Within a few years, it exploded into a center of a textile industry. Its population soared to 40,000 by 1780 and 70,000 by 1801. Visitors described the cloud of coal vapor that polluted the air, the pounding noise of steam engines, and the filthy stench of its river. This growth of industry and rapid population growth dramatically changed the location and distribution of two resources: labor and people. Identify supporting details. What led to the massive migration of people from farms to cities?
What happened here? Okay, so what led to the massive migration of people from to cities? I don't know why I didn't notice it wasn't scrolling down, so I'm sorry. Okay, so what led to the mass migration? And now I'm over scrolling. What was going on in the farms? Why did people want to go to the cities? Okay. Largely, in case you're not coming up with an answer, largely, people in the farms were poor. They felt that they could benefit, their families could benefit more from industrial work. The rise of new social classes. This is kind of interesting.
The rise of new social classes. The Industrial Revolution helped create both a new middle class and a new urban working class. The middle class included entrepreneurs and others who profited from the growth of industry and the rise of cities. The middle class enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle. When farm laborers and others moved to the new industrial cities, they took jobs in factories or mines. In rural villages, they had strong ties to a community where their families had lived for generations. In the cities, they felt lost and bewildered. In time, though, factory and mine workers developed their own sense of community. The lives of the new middle class. Those who benefited most from the Industrial Revolution were the entrepreneurs who set it in motion. The Industrial Revolution created this new middle class, or bourgeoisie, whose members came from a variety of backgrounds. Some were merchants who invested their profits in factories. Others were inventors or skilled artisans who developed new technologies. Some rose from rags to riches, a pattern that the age greatly admired. Middle-class families lived in well-built, well-furnished homes. In time, middle-class neighborhoods had paved streets and a steady water supply. These families dressed and ate well. The new middle class took pride in their hard work and their determination to get ahead. Only a few had sympathy for the poor. As a sign of their new and improved status, middle-class women sought to imitate the wealthy women of the upper classes. They did not do physical labor or work outside the home. They hired maidservants to care for their homes and look after their children. The lives of the working class. While the wealthy and the middle class lived in pleasant neighborhoods, vast numbers of poor struggled to survive in foul-smelling slums. They packed into tiny rooms in tenements or multi-story buildings divided into apartments. These tenements had no running water, only community pumps. Early industrial cities had no sewage or sanitation systems, so waste and garbage rotted in the streets. Sewage was also dumped into rivers, which created an overwhelming stench and contaminated drinking water. This led to the spread of diseases such as cholera. Workers' protests. During the early Industrial Revolution, there were no labor unions, organizations of workers who bargained for better pay and working conditions. As the Industrial Revolution began, weavers and other skilled artisans resisted the new labor-saving machines that were replacing their jobs. From 1811 to 1813, protesting workers, called Luddites, smashed machines and burned factories. The Luddites were harshly crushed. Although frustrated workers continued to protest, they were forbidden to form worker associations and strikes were outlawed. Methodists helped the poor. Many working class people found comfort in a religious movement called Methodism. John Wesley had founded the Methodist movement in the mid-1700s. Wesley stressed the need for a personal sense of faith. He encouraged his followers to improve themselves by adopting sober, moral ways. Methodist meetings featured hymns and sermons promising forgiveness of sin and a better life to come. Methodist preachers took this message of salvation into the slums. There they tried to rekindle hope among the working poor. They set up Sunday schools where followers not only studied the Bible, but also learned to read and write. Methodists helped channel workers' anger away from revolution and toward reform. Make generalizations. How did members of the working class react to their new experiences in industrial cities?
Okay, so what do you think? How did working class, how do they feel? Well, when they talk about workers protesting, they're typically not happy. So that'll give you the first inclination that things weren't great. But usually if there's ever a question set up like this, usually in this time period in history, the result is protests or, rioting, boycotting. That's usually the history terms we're working
Harsh
with.
conditions in factories and mines. The heart of the new industrial city was the factory. There, the technology of the machine age imposed a harsh and dangerous way of life on workers. The miners who supplied the coal and iron for the industrial age faced equally unsafe working conditions. Hazards of the factory system. Working in a factory system differed greatly from working on a farm. In rural villages, people worked long hours for low wages, but their work varied according to the season. Life was also hard for poor rural workers who were part of the putting out system. If they worked too slowly, they did not earn enough, but at least they worked at their own pace. In the factories of industrial towns, workers faced a rigid schedule set by the factory whistle. Working hours in early factories were long, with shifts lasting from 12 to 16 hours, 6 or 7 days a week. The factory whistle announced time to eat a hasty meal, then quickly sent them back to the machines. Exhausted workers suffered accidents from machines that had no safety devices. They might lose a finger, a limb, or even their lives.
Awful.
In textile mills, workers constantly breathed air filled with lint, which damaged their lungs. Those workers who became sick or injured lost their jobs. At first, women made up much of the new industrial workforce. Employers often preferred to hire women workers. They thought women could adapt more easily to machines and were easier to manage than men. More important, they were able to pay women less than men, even for the same work. Factory work created a double burden for women. Their new jobs took them out of their homes for 12 hours or more a day. They then returned to their tenements, which might consist of one damp room with a single bed. They had to feed and clothe their families, clean, and cope with such problems as sickness and injury. Dangers in the mines. As the demand for coal and iron grew, more mines were opened. Although miners were paid more than factory workers, conditions in the mines were even harsher than in the factories. Miners worked in darkness, and the coal dust destroyed their lungs. There were always the dangers of explosions, flooding, and collapsing tunnels. Women and children worked in mines, carting heavy loads of coal. Children were frequently hired to work in mines because they could climb through narrow shafts. Many spent their days on all fours or carried heavy baskets of coal up flimsy ladders.
Awful.
Children performed risky work.
Look at those faces.
Children had always worked on rural farms or as servants and apprentices. However, child labor took on new dimensions during the Industrial Revolution. Since children had helped with farm work, parents accepted the idea of child labor. The wages children earned were needed to keep their families from starving. Factories and mines hired many boys and girls. These children often started working at age 7 or 8, a few as young as 5. Nimble-fingered and quick-moving, they changed spools in the hot and humid textile mills, where sometimes they could not see because of all the dust. They also crawled under machinery to repair broken threads in the mills. Conditions were even worse for children who worked in the mines. Some sat all day in the dark, opening and closing air vents. Others hauled coal carts in the extreme heat. In the early 1800s, Parliament passed a series of laws called Factory Acts to reform child labor practices. These early efforts were largely ignored. Then in 1833, Michael Sadler headed up a committee to look into the conditions of child workers in the textile industry. The Sadler report contained first-hand accounts of child labor practices and helped bring the harsh labor conditions to light. As a result, Parliament passed new regulations to ease working conditions for children. An 1833 law forbade the hiring of children under the age of 9 and limited the working hours of older children in the textile industry. Over time, Parliament passed other laws to improve working conditions in both factories and mines and to limit the workday of both adults and children to 10 hours. It also enacted laws to require the education of children and to stop the hiring of children and women in mines. Draw conclusions. How did the Industrial Revolution change the lives of men, women, and children?
Okay, so we could go through, we could go through and discuss how the lives of men were changed, how the lives of women were changed, and how the lives of children were changed. As they said, in the children, how awful. I can't even imagine my 5-year-old working in a mine. So labor reform brought attention to children's working conditions. Here's a political cartoon. What does a cartoonist seem to think about the practice of child labor? Okay, so there's this giant hand that's squishing all these kids, and it says child labor employer is the hand, and it's just squishing, breaking the backs of these kids. So that in and of itself, the picture in and of itself speaks to how children were treated during this time period. Not well. Okay, so if I can, I don't know. That's it for today. I was going to try to make this screen over here larger, but I don't know. I don't know what it's doing. So that's all for today. I'll push out another video in a couple days. All right.